Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the band that played earlier, because Gavin, who works in our office, used to play in the band, and I thought he was going to leave walk off the pub. I'll come later. And it's nice to be here in the Sobel Centre, because I'm a Sobel Centre in my constituency as well. So I wrote it in my diary as Keir Hardie Veteran Sobel Centre. You're very lucky I didn't just walk home and go. So I came here to South Wales to give the lecture, and I'm very, very honoured to give the lecture. I think it's important we do commemorate those who went before, what they did and what they achieved. And indeed, one of my predecessors as Member of Parliament for my own constituency was a very famous man in the mid-19th century called Charles Duncan, who was the one indeed who was prepared to present the great Chartist petition to Parliament in the 1850s. And he's commemorated in a street and a school, and it's a great history lesson for the children in that school. Because I'm absolutely passionate that our children should grow up understanding what went before, understanding those who suffered that we might benefit in succeeding generations, and understand that all that we have is dear. Our National Health Service, free education, council housing, so many other things, came from the struggles of ordinary people in the Labour movement. He's been a very good friend to me in Parliament, and we shared these desks in the cloisters when we were both first elected, and it was a rather limited space that we had, and it was sort of made up of piles and piles of paper. These were pre-email days, and it was environed by my dog wandering up and down. We sort of sat on people's desks, and then the dog would get lost. And the dog would get out, and the police would have to bring the dog back. The dog actually was the major part of the Labour team in the cloisters at the time. It was a very smart dog. And that dog also came here during the miners' strike, because my constituency party was joined with Tower Colliery during the miners' strike, and we brought a delegation of people here to Tower Colliery to bring tidings and bring support, and one day we brought a whole coachload of people from my constituency with lots of supplies. It was an education for all of us that came that day, and I came on many other occasions, to support the miners in the strike they went through. It was an education of the sheer brutality of what that Tory government did to this and so many other communities all across South. I'm really delighted to recognise Tyrone O'Sullivan is here today from Tower Colliery. Tyrone, thanks to you and everybody else from Tower Colliery for everything you did during the strike and afterwards. And also personally, many years later, my late brother, who was a mining engineer and surveyor, wanted to visit Tower Colliery, and they were treated me so royally and really well. He died 2 years after that, and forever grateful to Tyrone and all those that said to me that day. Tyrone, at the party conference last year, I was invited to speak at the launch of the new book about Keir Hardie, What Would Keir Hardie Say?, edited by Pauline Bryant. And I committed a chapter to this book on the international legacy of Hardie. I didn't realise then that when I started writing this chapter, what was going to happen, and there was going to be a leadership contest, and that I would be the first person for 100 years to lead the Labour Party who had a beard. So the book is a wonderful thought process on what Keir said and did, but also how you take those ideas forward. And I would also recommend very strongly Caroline Ben's book on her biography of Keir Hardie. Caroline wrote this wonderful book, and somewhere along the line she was given care from Keir Hardie's house, which used to be in Tony Benn's study in their house before, obviously, both sadly now passed on. And whenever I went to a meeting at Tony's house, and everything to it, he was very keen on his team. The last person to come always got to sit on the Keir Hardie chair, not as a point of honour, because it was frankly the most uncomfortable chair. You had to sort of come on and back of it. So if you slumped at all during a long discussion and becoming a bit tedious, you would lean back and just think, would piggy you back. And I don't know where it came from. Obviously, a church where they didn't want to go before the street during the long sermon. They put that thing in the back. But friends, it's really great honour to be able to talk here about Keir Hardie. What he did, why he founded the Labour Party, and what inspired us. I'm not giving a historical lecture. I'm not a historian. History is a very controversial subject, and it's not for me to decide all of that, but I think it is up to all of us to understand what Keir was about and how we learn from it. He was born in Scotland, he represented Parliament in the 60s, in England first in West Ham, and then later here in Wales. He knew this part of Wales very well. His work with Solidarity, mine work all over the country, and here. He got to know the South Wales hospital during the 6 months miners' strike in the late 19th century, and later went on to become the MP for this area. And indeed, in those days, it was possible to be a candidate of more than one constituency in a parliamentary election. And the people that were advising him, and the Independent Labour Party at the time, Labour Representation Committee, including the Labour Party, said that it would be much better off if he contested an election in Preston, not here, as he had more chance of winning in Preston, in Lancashire. And so, as an obvious compromise, they decided to contest both elections, but he was a candidate. And as you know, it was a very easy journey by train from here to Preston. And so, he spent the whole of the election campaign shuttling by train between the two constituencies, and was not elected in Preston, but was elected here. Well done, the people of Wales, on choosing such a great idea. Looking over the town over there, I'm really pleased to see that this week, Grace Sun of this area, the General Secretary of the PCSU, Mark Walker, has joined the Labour Party, and he's very welcome to it. Our membership has doubled in the less than a year since the general election. And well, we've got huge issues that we have to face as a party, as a society, as a community. We need to think about the values we put forward and how we do these things. Because the struggles that were once fought in mills and mines and factories are being fought today in a different way. That's what we once said. Call centres are the new dark satanic mills, where people have to put their hand up to ask to go to the toilet. It may not be a factory or steel foundry, but they're very difficult jobs, turnover rates are huge, low pay, generally oppressive to the human spirit and what people can achieve from it. The injustice in the workplace is still there. Those people that are on zero-hours contracts, those people that have very poor working conditions, those people in non-unionised places where maybe the employer is overpowerful. We need to address all of this and address the problems that many people who are self-employed also face. Because the self-employed can also be exploited just as much as the employed can be exploited. And so what we're going to be launching very soon is something called Workplace 2020. It's going to be the biggest ever discussion about the world of work. It's going to be led by our Shadow Minister for Trade Unions and Civil Society, Ian Labour MP, former President of the National Union of Mine Workers. The idea is that we develop from that a series of legislative proposals from which we can legislate when we have a Labour majority in Parliament in the future. We don't want to wait until 2020 to work out what we want to do. We want to work out what we want to do now, campaign for it now. So come 2020, there's a full understanding in the entire community that we're not going to put up with the kind of working conditions, 0 hours contract, insecure employment, gross exploitation, undercutting wages, race to the bottom, which is all that the Tory party and the Liberal Democratic compasses can offer at the present time. Let's do something better. there is record employment, but they can boast some other records as well. Record in work poverty. We want more jobs, they can and must be good jobs and good policy. Too many people today, work is fundamentally insecure, instability leads to instability at home. That instability leads to family breakup, leads to children underachieving in school, and contributes to the mental health crisis that's facing the whole of the UK. I am very determined that we as the Labour Party and the Labour movement will stand up for real parity of scheme between physical and mental health, and be proud enough and strong enough to stand up. Low pay, zero-hours contract, temporary agency workers, umbrella companies, bogus self-employment, workfare, unpaid internships, and some low-quality apprenticeships we use circa minimum wage. We have to stand up on these issues. Minimum wage legislation was what Keir Hardie called for, and eventually a Labour government delivered in 1997. And Labour government councils across the UK are now promoting a living wage, and many have signed up to the living wage. That is a good thing, that's a great step forward. That's Labour in office, in local government, in public authorities, delivering living wages for people, rather than the unfair level of the minimum wage set at the present time. Last Saturday I was at an event that totally inspired me. I was in Scarborough, in North Yorkshire, and the Bakers Union and some other unions organised a young workers' event for those who work in the fast food industry, campaigning for a £10 an hour minimum rate of pay in that industry. Copying what has been done by American workers on a $15 an hour campaign for fast food workers in McDonald's and other companies all across the USA. And it's called the imagination of large numbers of young people across the USA who have been energised and politicised by this and are now joining in the whole debate around the Democratic primaries and supporting Bernie Sanders in doing so. On April 14th, they called a worldwide day on decent pay for those in the fast food industry, takeaway industries. It is a major employer all around the world, and it seems to me the kind of campaign that Keir Hardie would have dreamt about. Sadly, he didn't have internet, he didn't have Twitter, he didn't have Facebook. We do, and we're going to join up with all those workers all around the world in demanding decency rather than excessive profits for those multinationals. It is a scourge of blacklisting of workers that assert workers' rights. Hardie became a union official and an organiser because he was blacklisted as a worker in 1879. Indeed, so many of the great leaders of the miners' unions in South Wales and the associations elsewhere became officials because they had been blacklisted by coal companies all across Britain. He started work in the mines at the age of 11, and it took him until he was 23 to be blacklisted, so he had some years of work in the mining industry. He was a child labourer in the mining industry, something that would be utterly illegal in this country now. Sadly, something that still happens in some parts of the world. That is where Keir Hardie's wonderful sense of internationalism came from. So I want to pay tribute to those that have stood up against blacklisting. The unions, the UK GMB Unite, campaigning against blacklisting, our front bench team, Andy Byrne particularly, and Steve Rotheram, who've taken up the cases of the blacklisting of people after the Shrewsbury picketing issue of 1972 and the incidents that happened at Albury during the miners' strike. We've got to be prepared to keep on about those gross injustices that happened, to learn the lessons from them and legislate to protect people in the future and prevent those things happening again. Fundamental structures of work and sadly many of the abuses remain unchanged. Unaccountable forces set your pay, your working conditions, the hours you work, whether you're a pension or not, there is so little accountability. unless we force it. Trade unions were founded, in a sense, to rebalance power in our society, to organise people together, to fight for their rights. They're the greatest force for equality. When trade unions are weak, inequality rises. When trade unions are strong, equality becomes better and more of a chance. Companies and organisations that have strong unions are better run, better managed, and actually more productive often than those that don't. That's why I was proud to join the trade union march during Cardiff this morning to give exactly that message of our party and the unions working together for good working conditions and the human rights of everyone. So, what's the Tory approach to this? They've always had a problem about workplace organisation and trade unions. They never kind of forced through Parliament their trade union bill. The UK already has the most restrictive trade union laws in Europe, and the Tories want to tighten it even further. We will continue to oppose this bill. Oppose this bill because it restricts trade unions' rights to speak out on behalf of their members, the political message they want to give, because it prevents them funding political activity, because it is yet again another attack on people's right to organise and work. 6 million people in Britain are members of trade unions. It's the largest voluntary organisation in Britain. How the Tories get over it and recognise 6 million people have a right to be heard, their views have a right to be listened to, and they have a right to be able to organise at the workplace. That's what we need. Cameron wanted to renegotiate the social chapter, as well as many other things in this endless odyssey around Europe. It's only the action of our Labour colleagues in the European Parliament, and I thank them and congratulate them for it, in partnership with trade unions all over Europe, that managed to keep that particular issue off the agenda. But mark my words, they're coming for it again. They want a market economy, we want an economy that works for all, and a social economy. So we will fight the trade union bill in the Commons, and when we're elected again in 2020, we will repeal that legislation and replace it with all the good ideas that I know are going to come out of Workplace 2020. Like here Harley, I believe the House of Lords should be abolished. As it is, I want to see it replaced by an elected second chamber. All political office ought to be accountable, and everyone who holds office ought to be elected to hold that office. That's a fundamental principle that I have. We managed to use both in the House of Commons, together with colleagues in the House of Lords, to force the government into a U-turn. In fact, a very important U-turn on working tax credits. Because we opposed that, because we mounted a campaign on it, because lots of people came to the streets to get out leaflets and sign petitions and send emails and all the other bits and pieces of campaigning we do, 3 million families on April the 1st will not lose £1,000 during the financial year. Tax credits are a lifeline to many people. 6 million workers in Britain now pay less than the living wage, so they're more necessary than ever. I will defend tax credits. I will at the same time be demanding much higher basic wages and a real living wage. Eventually, that will reduce the requirement for tax credits, not eliminate it, but reduce it. But the principle has to be that we support what the last Labour government did in bringing that in. In Parliament, there's often a vain Tory mob. I'm very familiar with that. And in Parliament, they derided Keir Hardie as the member for the unemployed. He saw this as a badge of honour, not an insult. He wasn't ashamed to stand up for the unemployed, the disabled, or those that are injured at work. He spoke with vision, with passion, with clarity. He acted with determination and courage, and our party wouldn't exist without it. It would not have achieved it all that it's done over the last century without the vision that he has. Yet many of our members and supporters feel that they have lost its way. And one of the turning points in this was the debate about the welfare reform and work bill. I'm glad that as a party we eventually came around to agree on decisions because that bill is about punishing the most vulnerable, the worst off within our society, and joining in a whole newspaper debate that condemns those that need support from the public purse because of the situation they're in. Our movement is about a welfare state. It is about good health. It is about good education. It is about good housing. It is also about a real safety net through which nobody should fall, so there should not be any destitution in our country. I think we've got to be strong enough and proud enough to be able to say that. The other is one of our greatest achievements, the welfare state, founded to eradicate poverty and homelessness and create the safety net we talked about. Such security does save lives, does prevent misery, and does create opportunity. Finding the left of the good from each according to their needs to each according to their needs. Since September, we as a party have therefore been opposing this bill, and as I said, we defeated it on some of its elements. So, we stand up on these principles. But I realise I was elected leader, not for me, not for who I am, but because our members wanted some commitment to the principles of our party. We're not turning the clock back to 1906, 1945, or 1997. What we're saying is, we're setting out a vision of a fairer, more decent society in a better world, inspired by the values that guide our movement and led by our greatest achievements: national health service, welfare state, comprehensive education, council housing, minimum wage, and so many other things. The Equality legislation we've got, that we delivered, Human Rights Act and Equality Act, are very important things. Our party is reasserting those values, reasserting itself as a campaigning movement. Now we must together develop policies to get those values to convince the country to get us elected in 2020. Keir Hardie took a lot of drives. He wore the risk on. He came to Parliament to represent working people. He took that responsibility seriously. Parliament isn't a forum to get a newspaper column, a better media profile, a stepping stone to a cushy corporate job, or an ego boost. We, as Labour MPs, are elected to Parliament to represent people, to make society better. We're here to work for our constituents. As I aspire to, and I know that Anne does here in Cumberland Valley. That's the time. Here was once asked by a House of Commons attendant when he arrived. He said, "Are you working here, mate?" He said, Hardie answered, "Yeah, I am." And the attendant then inquired, "Where?" "On the roof." And he said to reply, "No, on the floor." The House of Commons chamber is often referred to as the floor. That was the way that they failed to recognise who this person was. When he took his seat in 1982, he refused to wear the then parliamentary uniform of a black frock coat, black silk top hat, and starched green collar. Instead, he wore a plain tweed suit, a red tie, and a deerstalker. He was lambasted at the press for wearing a cloth hat in Parliament. I know we've moved on from these silly jokes. Really, no right here, not for what he wore, let's see where it's tied today. What he stood for. Let's just go through a few of the policies he fought for. Healthy homes and fair rents. That was so healthy homes and fair rents. Tragically, that demand is still necessary today. Capitalism has fallen to its lowest level since the 1920s. Rents up, evictions are up, homelessness is up, home ownership falling as people are priced. Neither in the 1940s, in addition to piloting natural health service legislation through Parliament, was also responsible for housing. And a very interesting interchange between him and senior civil servants. They said, "Minister, what you're asking us to do on housing isn't the right thing to do, it's not necessary."
He said, what do you mean? He said, the quality of the homes we're asking us to build for council housing is far too high, far too expensive. Why can't we build them cheaper and just do cheap homes and the way that we get more homes that way? He said, no. These are homes for working people. These are homes for their lives. These have to be of the best quality, of decent space, of good size. Look at the number of 1940s council houses that are still around compared to the systems of housing. And particularly in England, the problem of the lack of regulation of the private rented sector is a real problem. With so many of our children growing up in unfit, grossly overcrowded accommodation, underachieving in school, insecure in their lives because they know they might be moved on in 6 months. We have to regulate the private rented sector as we would any other business within the school. Understand this, they absolutely understand and totally get it. Because when Theresa Pearce, one of our excellent Labour MPs, introduced an amendment to the housing bill, which was actually very simple, just a couple of lines, it said, any home put out for rent on the private renting market must be fit for human habitation. Not a particularly complicated concept, not difficult to ask for, and clearly there already in other legislation. They voted it down. He voted down a requirement that every home be fit for human habitation. We know what their agenda is, we know what our agenda is, we know which is the right one to follow, as I'm sure you do as well. Carney also called for graduated income tax, progressive taxation. Yet the Tories have cut the 50p tax rate to 45, and we're going to budget in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm not taking any bets on what the proposals are in that. These Tories actually called it a major success when they turned up in Parliament and said they convinced big multinational companies to pay a tax rate of 2%. Treasury questions, Treasury Chancellor John McDonnell asked George Osborne about tax justice. And there was one of those wonderful pauses. Osborne looked up like this, slightly perplexed for a minute, looked at John, completely blank, and John just said, don't worry, Google it. Of taxation, where big business like Google and others get to negotiate the rate of tax, the rest of us have to pay the tax that we're required to pay. Sorry, those days are going to be over come 2020. We all collect the tax. I was invited to speak at the British Chamber of Commerce conference. Some might say an unusual place for me to go and speak. We all agree on that. But they said, well, they're not natural allies. Actually, in her biography of Keir Hardie, Caroline Benn wrote, he, this Keir Hardie, profoundly believed the entrepreneur was as ill served by giant cartels and monopolies as were working men and working people. And there's a lot in that. Many of those people that develop brilliant ideas, small innovative businesses, developing high technology stuff, find they hit a glass ceiling. And a glass ceiling put there by very big international banks who then force them to sell the business to a hedge fund somewhere else and often transfer the manufacturing somewhere else. You've got to crack down on abuses that force employers into a race to the bottom. I enjoy going to local coffee shops in my area, and lots of coffee shops. I'm very friends with the owner and his family, love them very well. I look across the street to another coffee shop owned by a chain. Who pays the most in tax? We all know the answer. My friend, or the shiny place across the road. And so we have to ensure there is fairness in taxation. So there has to be the creation of a level playing field. The employment rights, fair taxes, strong rights for consumers, stop the undercutting of good businesses like that. Tax, yeah, it is a burden to many people, it's seen as a burden, but in reality, it's the price we all pay in a civilised society. Let's be clear, this government has cut taxes for the rich and slashed taxes for large corporations, and we are all paying the price for that in a higher level of tax than many others, and destruction of so many of the very valuable public services on which we all rely. Revolution. Again, something we delivered as a Labour government in 1997 in both Scotland and Wales. But more importantly, what's been achieved in government here in Wales? Free prescriptions, not so in England. No troubling student fees, not so in England. No fight with junior doctors, instead agreement. I had the pleasure of a couple of hours with a group of junior doctors 2 weeks ago. Wonderful people. They shouldn't be called junior doctors, they should be called doctors, but that's what they are. Many have studied hard and worked hard in order to serve the public within the National Health Service. Social care budget also protected, and I'm very proud to say education maintenance allowance, which has been abolished in England, has been protected by Labour and Wales. That EMA is the passport to higher education, the passport to college and university, and to so many skills that working class kids would be denied if we didn't have EMA to get them through A-levels and education. MPs that promoted the education provision of meals all those many years ago. So, in the Labour government of Wales, with free breakfast for all primary school kids, these things are very important. It shouldn't be, but it is. Many parents dread the onset of the long holiday in summer, the Easter holiday, because there's no free breakfast for their kids and no free school meal. It shouldn't be like that. All children should get a decent meal before they start off in school. Peter Hartley also stood, very interesting, very important, for women's right to vote. At a time when it was not popular, only men had the franchise at that time, and even many in the Labour movement didn't support him when he argued for universal suffrage. He was arrested supporting women's rights to vote as part of the whole suffragette movement. He was a great friend of Sylvia Pankhurst, herself was imprisoned, and indeed she suffered grievously in Holloway prison in my constituency. And we're building a new library next to the site of the prison, the prison is usually closed, and I'm very determined that in that library we will remember all those women who suffered in that prison because they suffered for the right to vote, which was eventually won. That is how so many of our rights were. Resigned his seat in Parliament in 1912 to cause a by-election in which the whole point was the women's right to vote. Sadly, he didn't win that by-election and he was out of Parliament for the next 10 years, but he made a massive contribution when he did come back. Next week is International Women's Day. It was our party that delivered and fought for equal votes, that delivered the Pay Act, that delivered the Equalities Act, and now I'm pleased to say we have a majority of women in the shadow cabinet. Think about how these things came about. Many would have seen the film about the women of Canada. Those women were striking and took in 1970 helped to bring about the Barbara Castle-inspired equal pay. But there's still a gender pay gap, there's still an opportunity gap, there is still discrimination. These things have to, must, and will be addressed. That is the cause of the Labour Party, trade unions, and the entire Labour movement. Peter Hartley was a real internationalist. He stood for equal rights all across the world. They weren't abstract concepts to him, they're something he campaigned for. And his vision, global vision, was impressive by any standards. He travelled the whole world at a time when he could only go by sea, and yet managed to visit South Africa, the United States and India and many other places. So he was often away for weeks at a time. But those that supported him and worked for him recognised the importance of the international work he was doing. This year is 100 years since his death, yes, but also since the barbarity of the Somme. He died just a few months before it. He opposed the First World War. He made himself very unpopular by doing so with some people. He spoke at a rally in Trafalgar Square on the day the Declaration happened, and he concluded his speech by saying, "Men and women of Britain, you now have an unexamplified opportunity of showing your power, rendering magnificent service to humanity and to the world. Proclaim for you that the days of plunder and butchery have gone. Send messages of peace and fraternity to your fellows who have less liberty than you." He understood this was very unpopular take, and he was handed as unpatriotic. But it's what he believed in, it's what he campaigned for, and he said there's nothing less patriotic than sending young men to die without a good cause. So we have to be internationalists. We can't be always like country right or wrong. We have to say, what is it that brings about peace and justice for all of us? He wanted to unite peace groups before that dreadful day of war arrived. He travelled Europe. He went to France, Germany, Russia, Ottoman Empire, and so many places, trying to bring peace together. Sadly, it didn't work. And millions of working men lined up against each other on the Western Front and slaughtered each other. I've been involved in the peace and war movement all my life, and I've been on many demonstrations. Perhaps the strongest message of Century On that we can give is a world of peace can only come, yes, by opposing militarism, but also the campaigning and building a socially just economic system and the complex work of conflict resolution and sustaining peace. None of this is easy, I know that, but it's something we have to do, we have to strive for. Syria and the horrors of that conflict present a huge challenge for today's political leadership. It needs patient, difficult diplomacy, working with people with whom we fundamentally disagree on many things, to try to bring about a cessation of the violence, an ability for refugees to return home, and a long-term peace. We have a responsibility to do our best for the Syrian people. We can't pretend this is easy. We have to engage in these meaningful efforts to bring about a peaceful and just world. There's a refugee crisis around the world at the present time, and a refugee crisis around Europe at the present time. One way is to put up barbed wire, another way is to use tear gas, a third way is to use electronic surveillance, and above all, say, these people are nothing to do with us. Sadly, it's not like that. These people are decent human beings. I've met many of them in refugee camps, in Calais, in Dunkirk. I've met many of them in other places. We have to have a political approach to bring about peace and justice in the region. We have to have a humanitarian approach so that people don't rot away in fetid refugee camps for years on end. Officers of the Parliamentary Human Rights Group, All Party Human Rights Group, for very many years. I'm not allowed to be an officer of the All Party Human Rights Group at the present time, so I now consider myself a supernumerary officer of the All Party Human Rights Group. Because human rights isn't an abstract concept. It's about the right of your belief, it's about the right to organise, it's about the right to expression, it's about the right not to be discriminated against, it's about the right not to be abused. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted after the Second World War by the United Nations, is a very precious and crucial document. I would like it to talk to every child in every school in our land. And that was the European Declaration of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. It's sort of hardly worth thinking about. One of the great causes of the Tory party as we move into the 21st century is to try and withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights and, by implication, withdraw from many of the very valuable sections of the European Convention on Human Rights. We will oppose that all the way. Value the Human Rights Act we've got. Because if we are serious about human rights, how can we condemn the persecution of religious minorities, gay and lesbian people, or anybody else in any other part of the world, if we withdraw from the convention that protects them from that persecution? There are many very human rights defenders around the world who we remember and mourn for what they did, how they suffered. And somebody died this week. You may not have heard the name, but she was a true wonderful woman. She was a human rights campaigner and an environmental defender against the destruction of her indigenous people's lands in Honduras. Berta Cáceres was killed in a home a few days ago in Honduras. She stood up for indigenous people. She stood up that they might be able to live in peace and not be persecuted by unbridled police, military and drug cartel power. And she held. In warning her, we send a message out that we don't forget and we don't pass by on the other side. And very brave people stand up for their human rights, because in standing up for their human rights, they're standing up for the human rights of everyone else. Peter Hardy knew that working for peace was difficult. We all know that. The complexities of the 21st century geopolitics are very different from those times, but the decisions and the principles endure. We're going to be faced with a referendum on Europe in June, and the Labour Party is going to campaign to remain in Europe, not because we love everything about the European Union and its bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but because we have managed to achieve some important things like the Agency Workers Directive, troubling a number of other things, but also because we want to work with, and I'm very keen on doing this, with socialists, trade unions and labour movement allies all across Europe to oppose the austerity agenda, to oppose the free market agenda and develop the social principles on which our movement was founded, on which other labour movements were founded all across this continent. Same that was laid out just 21 years into our existence, when Peter Hardy said, the movement should not rest until the sunshine of socialism and human freedom break forth upon our land. I can't think of a better description of what our country needs now, to break through from the narrow, nasty, divisive politics of the Conservatives and hold the vision out of a different and better economy. Socialism makes more of one system, said Peter Hardy, but socialism also builds a system, as it says on a membership card, in which power, wealth and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few. The 1945 general election produced a Labour majority, gave us a National Health Service, gave us a welfare state, gave us the basis of common ownership of some major industries. It served the people very well. It gave us 2 decades of full employment, it gave us 2 decades of growth in adult and higher education and in opportunity for so many people. Somewhere along the line in the late 1970s and 80s, we got into Milton Friedman, free market economics, Reaganomics and Thatcher. We then had the selling off of state assets, the shrinking of the state, the growth of the gap between the richest and the poorest, and we saw the destruction of the steel industry, the mining industry, and so much manufacturing industry in Britain. We had the 1986 Social Security Act, which destroyed a lot of the basis of the welfare state. We're still paying the price for that. Surely the cause of our movement and our party is to develop an economy which does work for all. that is prepared to invest in growing and developing high-tech manufacturing industry, that is developing an economy for all. We're supported in our work by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, by Mariana Mazzucato, and many others. Contacted us to say, can we help you develop the economic policy of the Labour Party? I said, yes, of course you can. But bear in mind, we're going to be developing that economic policy in partnership with all the ordinary people of this country, as we have these economic policy conferences and ideas all around the country. Because we have to challenge something very fundamental. I come from a generation that had the opportunity, for example, of free university education. And I believe it's my duty to take that away from other people. But I felt being told by so many people, isn't it a shame that young people growing up today have so much less opportunities than we had, so much harder up, and life is so much tougher for them? And isn't it a shame that the next generation are not going to have a welfare state, not going to have a social security system, and not going to have pensions? And I asked myself a pretty basic question, really. Hang on a minute. The world is richer now than it has ever been. Technology is more brilliant than it's ever been. The rapid advance of technological improvements is amazing. And I was asked a very interesting question at a meeting in Lewisham the other night about automation. Is it a threat or is it an opportunity? And I said, yes, it can be a threat. Just as the loss of jobs in the steel industry and others in the 19th century was brought about by automation. The riots that took place in Birmingham by the nail makers. They were opposed to machine-making nails because their only economic protection was to make nails by hand. They couldn't keep up with machines, they were destroyed and pushed aside. So, if we are to benefit from the technology and advances that are there, we have to develop an economic system that shares out the wealth, the resources and the opportunity so that we all benefit from it, not just the few. We don't want robot-run industry with high levels of unemployment outside. Surely what we want is a short working week and everybody working. Can't solve all of our problems. It can't solve the environmental problems, and it can't solve an awful lot of things. And so we have to put an alternative. In May we have elections, a chance to vote Labour in those elections in May. In England, in Wales, and in Scotland. Well, we also get a message across about austerity and what the Tories are doing. It's a political choice, not an economic necessity. They're putting everybody's prosperity. They won't stand up to working people. They're cutting in work support or millionaires get tax breaks. They're a risk to all of our finances. They're failure to invest in putting our economy in this. We, Labour, will stand up for people to build an economy that works for all, where prosperity is shared. We will stand up for families wanting somewhere decent to live. We will stand up against the Tory cuts to public services that we all rely on, protecting, enabling policing, and the cuts and the tax bill to our national health service. But we also put forward a point of view that we want a society that allows the human spirit to develop, allows us to understand the importance of environmental sustainability as much as economic sustainability. They're not alternatives, they're part and parcel of the same thing. But also to understand our history and our cultural values. We're talking here about Ian Hardy and what he said and what he did. In every child, there's a poem. In many people, there's a novel. In millions of kids, there's wonderful paintings. In everyone, there is some sense of beauty. There are those traditions. We heard a band earlier on, we all have those views. I want to see our children learning in school the history of where they came from, where our movement came from, where our rights came from, where our opportunities come from. But I also want to see our children, every one of them, learning music, learning theatre, learning dance, and learning art. Not because their parents are rich enough to send them to stage school, because every school should. Those values of our movement, those values of our culture, those values of our dreams, those values of the poets, the artists, the musicians, the scientists, the engineers, and the ordinary people. We want to see that everybody matters, that everybody can contribute and achieve something in our world and in our society. That's what brings us together, this wonderful family called the Labour Movement. Thank you very much.